Good evening. It's wonderful to see this auditorium jam-packed for this wonderful presentation that Dr. Leila Fawaz has prepared for us. My name is Jamshed Bharucha, and I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President at Tufts. And this conference really this is the third annual conference of its kind. Each year has just gotten stronger and stronger, exploring events of the Middle East. And I'm sure that the next few days really promise to be one of the most productive conferences that I've been to, even though this is not my field. They've given me a little tag saying speaker, but I'm only here to introduce. But many of you are in the field, and I'm sure you will agree that it will be productive, as you will see. When Leila first shared with me some possible speakers, I immediately recognized the name of Robert Pape, our speaker today, and my eyes lit up, and I said, yes, Bob Pape is exactly the person we want to lead off this conference, to be the keynote speaker. I had known him. I had been his dean at Dartmouth. And I knew really what a jewel he was. He had just written a book while we were both at the same institution called Bombing to Win, which made an extraordinary impact and really launched him in a sensational way. He found himself on all of the news programs and really found himself the subject even of a book. I believe there's an edited volume about the work of Bob Pape. There aren't that many scholars who have entire books, conferences, and books written about them at this age. You can see he doesn't look that old. His newest book, Dying to Win, so Bombing to Win and then Dying to Win, is, I assume, some of the material that you'll hear about today, and that, too, has had an extraordinary impact. It's a work of great courage, certainly goes against the grain of some of the thinking that we have seen in the last few years. And as you will see, his work is really of relenting honesty and courage and integrity, and a real example of how a good academic work in the political arena can hopefully influence the policy in Washington. Bob has been, again, on doing the rounds of media. He's being discussed on the blogs, and he's been the author of multiple op-ed pieces. He now directs he's at the University of Chicago as a faculty member, but he also founded and directs the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob Pape.
Thank you very much. It is a distinct honor and pleasure to be here today for many reasons. And I'd like to thank Mr. President. Thank you so much for being here. And I'd also like to thank Professor Fawaz for really inviting me and putting together one of the most remarkable conferences that I've had the pleasure to be involved with. Over the last many months, I've been privileged to be in numerous settings in government and universities, but I have rarely, if ever, seen such an international conference with so many fine minds from around the world. And it is a very great honor to be among them. I'd also like to say a word that it's a personal pleasure to be again in the same in the presence of Jamshed. In my 15 years, I've known many university leaders, and Jamshed ranks for me among the very finest. He combines what we truly often ask for in our university leaders, a strong commitment to intellectual excellence with also a commitment to bringing together a diverse faculty and holding them together so that they can disagree somewhat in peace without it breaking into war. And Jamshed is a real model for me in that regard. Suicide terrorism is rising around the world, but there's great confusion about why. since many of the attacks, including 9/11, have been perpetrated by Muslim suicide terrorists, many have presumed that Islamic fundamentalism must be the obvious central cause. This presumption has fueled the belief that future 9/11s can be avoided only by wholesale transformation of Muslim societies, which was a core reason for broad public support for our invasion of Iraq. However, the presumed connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism is misleading, and it may be encouraging domestic and foreign policies likely to worsen our situation. Over the last few years, I've collected the first complete database of every suicide terrorist attack around the world from 1980 to early 2004, defined in the classic sense that you would expect when I use that term of an attacker killing himself or herself on a mission to kill others unless explicitly authorized by a state. There are a handful of North Korean suicide attacks that are not counted in this database. And I've recently updated this database for the crucial case of Iraq through June of 2006. When I published the first version of this database a few years ago as an academic article, at that point I knew that no academic or think tank had collected such a database. What I didn't know was that no government had at that point either. You see, I was quickly contacted by the Department of Defense. That's who DTRA is, the part of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And what I didn't know until that point, you see, I'm sure many in the room know, that the United States has been collecting ordinary terrorism statistics going back decades, much like the British government, starting in the mid-1970s. We do this at Monterey, California, which then feeds that data into the Defense Department, CIA, and other parts of the government. What I didn't know until I was contacted by DTRA was that we didn't begin to track suicide terrorism until the fall of 2000. So they were very interested in getting the data, which I gave them, and in return, they were one of the generous funders, which made it possible for me to become, as Jamshed mentioned, the director of the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism. And I'd also like to point out that this has also been generously funded by the Carnegie Corporation in New York, Argonne National Laboratory, and the University of Chicago itself. And it's really been wonderful to have such generous support, because what this has enabled us to do is to put together a team of about 10 researchers fluent in all the key native languages, that is Arabic, Hebrew, Tamil, and Russian, that are associated with this phenomenon, so that we can collect information about suicide terrorist attacks around the world, not just in English, but we can really penetrate the language barrier. This survey examines all the available open source documents from the suicide terrorist groups themselves, from the target countries, from the media, that is including Lexis and Phoebus, computerized databases, but also hard databases. And in addition, we've also sent people to conduct international research, essentially to Cairo and Beirut. Today, I'm going to present tables and charts and summaries of data, but I want to emphasize that this is not just a list, and it's not just a list of lists, but represents a rather large amount of new information about suicide terrorism. And I brought a couple of things to show you in this regard. First, this glossy yearbook-like album. This is published in Jaffna in Sri Lanka, and as I'm sure many of you might be able to see, this is published by the Tamil Tigers. And if you don't mind, it might just be helpful for me to walk around a little bit so you can get a real look at it. And it's dedicated to the Black Tigers. That is the suicide attackers for the Tamil Tigers. And as you can see, it's not glorification of body parts. It's their names, their ages, their birthplaces, and other socioeconomic data about the actual suicide attackers. Now, these are not being published and then sent to Langley. In fact, about a year ago, when I gave this talk to my first undisclosed location, that's where National Counterterrorism Center is, the folks who do Sri Lanka there came down to get a copy. I was glad to give it to them. But the fact is, it's documents like this, once we penetrate the language barrier, that really provide a wealth of new information about suicide terrorism. In addition, now, how do we keep track? Well, I like to use a two independent source verification rule. Every bit of data you see here today has been verified by two sources of information. That is, I don't rely on internet chat rooms with uncorroborated data where somebody just throws in a bit of data. And I don't even rely just on data from the suicide terrorist groups themselves. Really have to have at least two independent sources of data to confirm it. And so to keep track, obviously we use Excel and so forth and so on, but I still like to use the old three-ring binder method that those of you who might have been involved in the government probably are still pretty familiar with, and so that we can actually keep hard copies of the actual sources of information. So what does the data show? The data shows that Islamic fundamentalism and suicide terrorism are not as closely associated as many people think. Overall, in the core database, there have been 315 completed suicide terrorist attacks worldwide. In this period, the world leader is the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka have done more suicide terrorist attacks than Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Further, at least 30% of Muslim suicide attacks were by secular groups such as the PKK in Turkey. Overall, at least 50% of suicide terrorist attacks were not associated with Islamic fundamentalism. Now, to explain suicide terrorism, my book analyzes the phenomenon at three levels. It seeks to explain why suicide terrorism makes sense for terrorist organizations, the strategic logic, why it gains mass support, the social logic, and what motives drive individuals to do it, the individual logic. Each level of analysis is important because suicide terrorism is conducted by non-state actors who lack the coercive apparatus of a state to compel either individuals or the surrounding society to go along with their operations. My book devotes essentially equal weight to these three, that one-third, one-third, one-third. Today I'm going to emphasize the strategic logic, partly due to time and partly because it's the logic that unifies the others. I'll be glad in the question period to talk about the others, and also I'll be glad to talk about the demographic profile of suicide terrorists. You see, this database of 315 attacks, altogether there were 462 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves. There were more terrorists who died than attacks because many of the attacks were team attacks such as 9/11. And so the fact is, by looking at 462 from all around the world during this near 25-year period, we really do have our first real look at the demographic profile. In the question period, I'll be glad to talk about that more if people would like that. Instead of religion, what nearly all suicide terrorist attacks have in common is a specific secular and strategic goal: to coerce a democratic state to withdraw combat forces. I don't mean advisors with sidearms. I mean tanks, fighter aircraft, and armored vehicles from territory the terrorists consider to be their homeland or prize greatly. From Lebanon to Israel to Sri Lanka to Kashmir to Chechnya, every suicide terrorist campaign since 1980 has been waged by terrorist groups whose main goal has been to establish self-determination for territory that they prize. Religion is rarely the root cause, although religion is often used as a tool by terrorist organizations in recruiting and in other efforts in service of the broader strategic objective. Three general patterns in the data support my conclusions. The first concerns the timing of suicide terrorist attacks. Suicide terrorism rarely occurs as an isolated or scattered or random phenomenon, as it would if it were merely the product of religious fanaticism or any ideology independent of circumstance. Instead, the attacks often occur in clusters that look very much like campaigns. And specifically, 301 of the 315 attacks occur in coherent, organized strategic campaigns that terrorist groups design for specific, mainly political goals. Only 5% are random or isolated attacks. Now, to be clear, I'm not claiming I can explain every suicide terrorist attack, but I am claiming that the patterns I'm going to identify do account for 95% of suicide terrorism. This table shows all the campaigns that have occurred since 1980, 18, 5 are ongoing. This table reorganizes the campaigns by the disputes that produced them. As you can see, suicide terrorist campaigns are directed at gaining control or maintaining control of territory that the terrorists prize. This has been the central objective in every suicide terrorist campaign. If we take the first one, Lebanon, give you an example. Hezbollah, that famous suicide terrorist group, did not exist in June 1982. In June 1982, Israel invaded southern Lebanon with 78,000 combat soldiers and 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles. 1 month later, Hezbollah was born. Hezbollah then began to use suicide terrorist attacks against Israel, the United States, and France, basically knocking each of those three out of the country at various points over the next 17 years. The important point is that when those forces left, when the American forces left Lebanon, when the French forces left Lebanon, and even when the Israeli forces left Lebanon, Hezbollah did not continue to send suicide attackers after them. That is, suicide attackers did not follow the Americans to New York, did not follow the French to Paris, didn't even follow the Israelis to Tel Aviv. They stopped completely when those combat forces left. That's just simply not a pattern, either the onset of the attacks or the ending of the attacks, that can be accounted for by Islamic fundamentalism. No one thinks Hezbollah today is any less Islamic fundamentalist than it was in 2000. Now, I'm not saying that foreign occupation or the threat of foreign occupation is a sufficient condition for suicide terrorism, but military presence or control of territory that the terrorists prize does appear to be virtually a necessary condition. The third pattern concerns target selection. If suicide terrorism is a calculated, coercive strategy, one might expect that this strategy would be applied against target states viewed as especially vulnerable to coercive punishment. And rightly or wrongly, democracies are widely viewed as soft, especially vulnerable to coercive punishment. And the target state of every suicide terrorist campaign has been a democracy. Let me talk about the PKK, which is a Turkish terrorist group that used suicide terrorism in this regard. I'm sure many in the room know that during the 80s and 90s, the Turks were at least moderately brutal toward the Kurds, and the PKK is a Kurdish terrorist group. And the PKK did use suicide terrorism against Turkey during that period, especially in the mid-1990s, in the mid to late 1990s. However, just a few miles away, Saddam Hussein was far more brutal to the Kurds the Kurds in Iraq. He was exterminating them at 10,000 people at a clip. And neither the PKK nor any other terrorist group ever thought to use suicide terrorism against Saddam Hussein. And now that we know more about the logic, the strategic logic underneath suicide terrorism, it helps to see why. Who would ever think that killing hundreds or even thousands of civilians would have ever caused Saddam to change his mind about anything? So the bottom line is that the timing, the goals, and the societies targeted by suicide terrorism suggest that it is a coherent strategy designed to cause democratic states to abandon territory that the terrorists prize. Al-Qaeda fits the pattern. Since Al-Qaeda's suicide terrorist attacks began, Al-Qaeda's strategic logic has been to compel American and Western combat forces to leave the Arabian Peninsula, a logic that Al-Qaeda has been pursuing with increasing vigor since 9/11. This table includes all the Al-Qaeda attacks since they began, and you can see I'm running out of room, but if you could just let your mind add London to the bottom, you can see that since 2002, if we include London, Al-Qaeda has been involved in over 17 suicide and other terrorist attacks, killing over 700 people. That's more attacks and more victims than all the years before 9/11 combined. Although many of us would have hoped that our counterterrorism efforts would have weakened the group, and we have killed and captured leader and cadre. By the measure that counts, the ability of the group to carry out attacks that can kill us, Al-Qaeda is stronger today than before 9/11. Now, there are multiple causes driving this threat, and I do not mean to deny that. However, the main cause driving the threat is the presence of American and Western combat forces on the Arabian Peninsula, and not merely Islamic fundamentalism or any other ideology independent of circumstance. Perhaps the best way to discuss this is to show you where Al-Qaeda's suicide attackers have come from. We have long known that a major goal of Osama has been to compel the United States to leave the Arabian Peninsula, but not how this goal relates to Osama's ability to recruit suicide attackers to kill us. This research is the first to collect the complete set of the 71 Al-Qaeda suicide attackers, that is, the 71 individuals who actually killed themselves to carry out attacks for Osama. Of those 71, we know the names, nationality, and other socioeconomic data about 67. And as you can see, the largest number, 34, have come from Saudi Arabia, the majority from the Persian Gulf, where the United States first began to station combat forces in 1990. It's important to underscore, even to an expert audience, that 1990 was a watershed year in America's military deployment to the Arabian Peninsula. Before 1990, yes, the United States had military advisors, basically folks with sidearms standing in embassies on the Arabian Peninsula, but no tanks, fighter aircraft, or armor units going all the way back to World War II. 1990 was a fundamental change in that deployment, and we've basically been there since, and the attacks start 5 years later. Notice where the suicide attackers are not coming from. Iran, surely an Islamic fundamentalist population with 70 million people, 3 times the size of Saudi Arabia, no Al-Qaeda suicide attackers. Sudan is an Islamic fundamentalist country, actually with a brand of Islamic fundamentalism so congenial to Osama, he chose to live there for 3 years in the 1990s. No Al-Qaeda suicide attackers. Pakistan is the largest Islamic fundamentalist country on the planet, 149 million people, 2. Well, if Islamic fundamentalism is what was driving the threat, we should have been seeing suicide attackers hopping out of Iran, hopping out of Sudan, and hopping out of Pakistan. And that's not the pattern that we saw. Now, I'm not saying that there's no transnational support for al-Qaeda, but it's crucial to see that the presence of foreign troops, especially American and Western combat troops, on the Arabian Peninsula is Osama's best mobilization appeal. Now, since we have the complete set of al-Qaeda suicide attackers, we can go further to assess the effect of America's military policies. With only one exception, al-Qaeda suicide terrorists from 1995 to early 2004 were all nationals of various Sunni-majority countries. Hence, we can compare the rate at which al-Qaeda suicide terrorists emerge from a Sunni country with American combat presence and without American combat presence. And as you can see, al-Qaeda suicide terrorists are over 10 times more likely to come from a Sunni country with American combat presence than a Sunni country without American combat presence. Obviously, if we folded the Iraq data into this, you would see that that is off the charts, in case you're wondering how Iraq would affect that. This does not mean that we should blame, Americans should blame themselves for the deaths that occurred on 9/11. Suicide terrorism is murder, and there's nothing that our combat forces did when they were stationed on the Arabian Peninsula that would justify the murder of our civilians. Moreover, I take no personal pleasure in telling you this. Jamshed didn't mention, but in the 1990s, the 3 years before I got to Dartmouth, I taught for the U.S. Air Force. I spent 3 years teaching Air Force officers who then went to Saudi Arabia to live, and I supported having our military forces there in the 1990s. I can tell you many stories of the extent to which they went to reduce their footprint, to not be injuring local society and customs in that deployment. But that should not cause us to overlook that what recruits suicide attackers for al-Qaeda better than anything else, Osama's best mobilization appeal, is the presence of American and Western combat forces on the Arabian Peninsula. Moreover, I'm not trying to tell you that all al-Qaeda suicide attackers have come from Sunni countries where we've stationed combat forces. 2/3 do, 1/3 do not. 1/3 are transnational in nature. But even if we look at the transnational al-Qaeda suicide attackers, we can see that the presence of American and Western combat forces on the Arabian Peninsula is a powerful motivating factor. And let me talk about the London bombers in this regard, since they would obviously be transnational al-Qaeda suicide attackers, and make 4 points about the July 2005 suicide attacks. First, the al-Qaeda group that claimed responsibility just 2 hours after the attacks and with specific operational details not yet in the press, said the London attacks were to punish Britain for British military operations in Iraq. Second, Hussein Osman. Hussein Osman is one of the would-be July 21st bombers, the guy we captured in Rome. In Osman's interrogation, Osman said, and I quote, "This was not about religion, this was about Iraq. We watched films of Western atrocities in Iraq." Third, Mohammed Khan. Mohammed Khan is the ringleader of the actual July 7th attacks. Al-Qaeda released his martyr video a few months after the attacks. And Mohammed Khan says on that video, and he says it in English, it's kind of eerie to listen to, that the London attacks were going to be, he hadn't done them yet, to punish Britain for military operations in Muslim lands. And finally, the British government itself. In 2004, the British government conducted a 4-volume survey of the attitudes of the 1.6 million Muslims living in Britain. These 4 volumes are still sitting on the London Times website for anyone who's interested in this survey. It's done by the Home Office. The Home Office found that between 8 and 13% of British Muslims believed more suicide attacks against the West were called for, and they further found the number one reason for that was Iraq. Now, I've been giving a lot of talks over the last year and a half. I've spoken to lots of intelligence agencies, and in fact, I'm in lots of debates with some of the people you'll also be seeing in this conference in the next few days with those intelligence agencies. One of the things that's really quite remarkable is that when I began this a year and a half ago, and I'm not saying I had anything to do with it, but when I began a year and a half ago, there was virtually no credit given, that is, to the explanation that it's possible that American military forces could be encouraging some of these attacks. Both the American NIE, which I think you know was released, the April NIE, and maybe even most dramatically, the head of MI5 just 2 months ago. If you go to the web and you search it, the head of MI5 2 months ago basically recounted the facts that I'm laying out for you. It's not to say they put all the weight, of course, on the presence of American troops. That's probably far too much to ask. But I do think the fact of the matter is, it really is quite amazing how many people, at least at the upper reaches of the bureaucracy, not necessarily the political level, are really starting to take this at least as a serious possibility. The implication of these findings. If al-Qaeda's transnational support were to dry up tomorrow, the group would remain a robust threat to the United States. However, if al-Qaeda no longer drew recruits based on the anger generated by American military presence in Sunni Muslim countries, the remaining transnational network would pose a far smaller threat and may simply collapse. What has al-Qaeda been up to since 9/11? Well, if we take a closer look at those attacks since 9/11, I think we can see how al-Qaeda's strategic logic has been evolving. Although it's true, many of the attacks have occurred across a broad geographic range and in many Muslim countries, notice the striking consistency in the victims of the attacks. The victims are consistently Western civilians, and not just any Western civilians. They are consistently Western civilians from countries that have deployed combat forces side by side with the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, and especially in Iraq, if you let your eye go down the chart. In other words, since 9/11, al-Qaeda has not been dormant. They haven't been thrown off kilter. They've been focused. They've been focused on stripping the United States of its military allies. And we know this not only from the pattern of the attacks, but because we have an important al-Qaeda strategy document. In September 2003, al-Qaeda published a 42-page strategy document on radical websites about how to deal with the United States given Iraq. This document was found by Norwegian intelligence in December 2003, and then it was given to both White House counterterrorism and DoD counterterrorism, the Office of Terrorist Strategy, in both. And we chose initially to put this document aside. Well, that actually is not been the case any longer, and you'll see why in a moment. This document says directly that with Iraq, al-Qaeda should not seek to attack the American homeland in the short term, but instead should focus on hitting America's allies. And then the document, and remember this is in the fall of 2003, discusses at the length of 42 pages whether they should hit Spain, Britain, or Poland. And they concluded they should hit Spain and Madrid just before the March 2004 election, because that would be the attack most likely to knock Spanish forces out of Iraq and put pressure on the British. And because this document is so important, I hope you don't mind, I'd like to just read a few sentences from it. Therefore we say that in order to force the Spanish government to withdraw from Iraq, the resistance should be dealt painful blows. It is necessary to make utmost use of the upcoming general election in Spain in March of next year. We think that the Spanish government could not tolerate more than 2, maximum 3 blows, after which it will have to withdraw as a result of popular pressure. If its troops still remain in Iraq after these blows, then the victory of the Socialist Party is almost secured, and the withdrawal of Spanish forces will be on its electoral program. Lastly, we are emphasizing that the withdrawal of Spanish forces from Iraq would put huge pressure on the British in Iraq. Well, those events happened just as they're called for. This document is still sitting on the Norwegian Intelligence Security website for anyone who wants to read it. And even though I've given this talk many times, I still don't know whether we actually gave this document to the Spanish government before the attack. Now, when I give this talk, especially in American audiences, some people think, and it's kind of easy to understand why, that's not so bad. They're going after our allies. They're not going after us. We care about the United States. Some people, many people don't think that, but some people do, and I say a couple things to that. First, notice how Al-Qaeda has moved fairly far down this road. That is, this variant of their strategy has been very successful, and they'll probably see themselves on the flat of the curve. Secondly, this document helps to put in greater relief Osama's most recent public statements. In the last year, Osama's given 2 public statements where he has said, and you can read them on the BBC website, which is the best place to find most of his statements, where he says directly, in words almost exactly similar to the Norwegian document, that for the last several years, Al-Qaeda has been focusing on hitting citizens and capitals of the European countries and Australia that have deployed combat forces side by side with the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now that's going to change. And in fact, you can see why that might fit with what we found out on August 10th this year, which is Al-Qaeda had a very serious plot to blow up airliners across the Atlantic, killing thousands of people that was fortunately disrupted by the British. But there are also other indications why Al-Qaeda has been more interested in attacking the United States in recent times. And I think rather than try to just talk to you about it, I think it would just be better to show you a recent Al-Qaeda recruitment video. I want to show you a video by Adam Gadon. Adam Gadon is an American. He was born in Riverside, California. He is 29 years old. He was born, his name is Adam. His father was Jewish. He was brought up actually as a Christian. And as a teenager, he converted to Islam. Well, since 1998, Adam has been living with Osama in either Afghanistan or in the upper reaches of Pakistan. Well, a few months ago, this recruitment video came out. It was sort of Adam's kind of coming out video, if you would. He's been on videos before this point, but with his face covered. And I think it just might be interesting for you to just hear how he's trying to incite people to become suicide attackers against us.
It's crucial for Muslims to keep in mind that the Americans, the British, and the other members of the coalition of terror have intentionally targeted Muslim civilians and civilian targets, both before as well as after September 11th, in both the first and second Iraq wars, as well as in their forays into Somalia and the Sudan and Afghanistan, just to give you a few examples. And they've done this with the support and backing of their populations and electorates. I mean, even if there have been some feeble protests scattered here and there in the West, chiefly against the latest war in Iraq, all the same, the governments which started these wars have been re-elected by a majority of the popular vote. In their aggression against Afghanistan, which for Westerners and their mercenary sympathizers is the least controversial of Bush and Blair's terrorist wars, They have targeted civilians for assassination and kidnapping. They kidnapped any non-Afghans they found and shipped them off to Guantanamo or worse. Many were handed over to the American and British-backed despotic regimes of the Islamic world to be brutally interrogated. And with the blessing and support of that notorious Afghan killer, Hamid Karzai, they've murdered thousands of Afghan civilians as they slept in their beds, traveled on the roads, attended weddings, and prayed at the mosques. I know they've killed and maimed civilians in their strikes because I've seen it with my own eyes. My brothers have seen it. I've carried the victims in my arms. Women, children, toddlers, babies in their mother's wombs. You name it, they've probably bombed it. I could go on, and that's just Afghanistan. We haven't talked about American and British atrocities in the two Iraq wars. Let's take a look at the latest to be revealed. In Mahmoudiyah, 5 American soldiers gang rape an Iraqi woman, and then, to hide the evidence, murder her and 3 members of her family and burn her body. And then, when our Mujahideen take revenge on the unit which committed this outrage and capture and execute 2 of its members, they're called terrorists, and Muslims are supposed to disown them or face the consequences. And I'm not saying that we should go and slaughter their women and children one by one like they did ours at Haditha and Ishaqi and Mahmoudiyah and God knows where else, even if some of our legal experts have permitted that. And even if it's hard to imagine that any compassionate person could see pictures, just pictures of what the Crusaders did to those children and not want to go on a shooting spree at the Marines' housing facilities at Camp Pendleton. But what I am saying is that when we bomb their cities and civilians like they bomb ours, or destroy their infrastructure and means of transportation like they destroy ours, or kidnap their non-combatants like they kidnap ours, no sane Muslim should shed tears for them. And they should blame no one but themselves, because they're the ones who started this dirty war, and they're the ones who will end it, by ending their aggression against Islam and Muslims, by pulling out of our region, and by keeping their hands out of our affairs. And unless they do that, neither Forest Gate-style police raids, nor Belmarsh or Guantanamo prison cells, nor the mosques and imams' advisory council will be able to prevent the Muslims from exacting revenge on behalf of their persecuted brothers and sisters.
No 72 virgins. From beginning to end, this is a recruitment appeal about the atrocities related to military occupation of Muslim lands. This is the poster boy for recruiting what you might call homegrown suicide attackers, either the United States, Britain, or maybe Australia. This is not being, notice this is in English. This is Adam Gadon. Al-Qaeda doesn't have many Adam Gadons. It'd be nice if they didn't have this Adam Gadon, to be honest. But the fact is, you can see that Al-Qaeda surely believes their best mobilization appeal is to emphasize the consequences of foreign military presence. Now, I'm not saying this is the only factor driving Al-Qaeda, but what I am saying is that it's terribly important that we take that seriously, because Al-Qaeda takes it seriously. They put emphasis on this to recruit. Now, notice in the facts that are being laid out, Adam is spinning the facts. He's exaggerating the facts. He gives us no credit for trying to police our own actions. But underneath it, those facts are true. Those facts are true. They were not being made up whole cloth. They were being spun, but the facts were true. I'd like to say a few words about Iraq. Iraq is a prime example of the strategic logic of suicide terrorism. Before the American invasion in March 2003, Iraq never experienced a suicide terrorist attack in its history. Since the invasion, suicide terrorism has been doubling every year that we've had about 150,000 combat forces stationed in the country. And that last line is just to June of 2006. We'll be finishing that collection of the data in a short period of time, and I'm quite confident that you will see that it has continued to double each year that we've been there. Now, many people say there's no logic to the attacks, that it's chaotic, and these are people I respect actually in some other, because they know quite a bit about war in general. I think it's because maybe they haven't seen the data on the geography and timing of the attacks, because in fact there is quite a bit of coherence to the geography and timing of the attacks. In fact, the geography of the attacks has been quite remarkably consistent over time, even as the attacks have been doubling. They have been consistently, the overwhelming majority of the attacks have been against the capital city, Baghdad, and the rest have been more or less evenly distributed around the country. This is normal. At least it's one of the normal models in an insurgency. It's one of the most common models that an insurgency would do most of its attacks in the capital, because insurgencies are often trying to convince the local population that the government cannot protect it. And if it can't protect its citizens in the capital, then where could it protect it? Now let's look at the targets of the attacks. Further, about 60 to 70% of the attacks have been consistently against military or government targets or political targets, which would bring the number up to near 80%, such as government buildings, police convoys, police stations, recruiting stations, assassination attempts on various government officials, or on Western troops and agencies. Only something like 15 to 25% have been against civilians not working for the Iraqi government or not standing in line to apply to work for the security forces or the Iraqi government. When you see a story in the New York Times or in the Washington Post or in the Boston Globe which said there's been another attack against civilians in Iraq today, that's often followed up with more detailed information just a few days later, sometimes on page 26, which explains who those civilians are. And not always, because there are attacks against mosques. There are attacks against markets on the open street. I don't deny that for a moment. But often, many of those civilian attacks are also targeting directly civilians either working for the government or trying to stand in line to work for the government. This pattern of the attacks suggests a fairly clear goal: to prevent the establishment of a government under the control of the United States. To do this, the terrorists are attacking targets they hope would undermine the confidence of the Iraqi population in the Iraqi government's ability to maintain order, and to discourage not just simply Shia, but Kurds and Sunnis from cooperating with this government. Now again, there are multiple causes to the suicide terrorism in Iraq, but the main cause to the suicide terrorism is the presence of American ground forces. We are widely viewed as the power behind the throne. Right now, there are at least 13 different terrorist organizations in the Sunni Triangle that are carrying out terrorist operations, at least four of which are doing suicide attacks. Some are more religious, some are patriotic, some allow foreigners, some do not. But what they agree on, what they have in common, is the belief that it's the American government that's the power behind the throne. And when their leaders go to make this case, what do they say? That it's the American government that controls all use of force in Iraq. Not just what the Americans do, not just what the British do, but what the Iraqi army does. And right now we're going through a debate. Should we surge in Baghdad or not? And notice how this debate and the role of the Iraqis in the debate and so forth, this is all being conducted in the United States. Yeah, we'll take a paper from Maliki every so often, but then we just give him his orders. Okay, we tell him, you accept this, or I guess we'll have to work with you to replace you, which is what the Hadley memo basically lays out. If you read the Hadley memo, this is, we either work with this guy or we come up with a different guy. Well, I'm afraid this is, in fact, widely believed inside of Iraq. And how this connects to the suicide operations in particular, our best window into this is Zarqawi's famous letter to Osama bin Laden in January 2004. At January 2004, Zarqawi sent a 19-page single-spaced letter to Osama laying out his strategy. He said he planned to use his suicide attackers, the Mujahideen, to focus on the security forces of the Iraqi government and Western agents in Iraq because these are, quote, the eyes, ears, and hands of the American occupier. Who are the Iraqi suicide attackers? So far, this has been murky, and what I'm about to show you only helps kind of remove that murkiness just a little bit. We are only able to confidently code somewhere between 50 and 20% of the Iraqi suicide attackers. I do not use, by the way, in this, anonymous internet chat room data that cannot be verified. Okay, so I'm not trying to say this is the only way to think about it, but given the problem we had with our WMD assessment in Iraq, I think it would be a very bad idea to build any assessment around uncorroborated internet chat room data that is anonymous. This is what we can confirm with double sources. Okay, 2 independent sources. This is what we can confirm, at least as of about 6 weeks ago. And as you can see, the largest number come from Saudi Arabia and Iraq, the overwhelming majority from Iraq and the Gulf states, and that is a pattern that's actually strongly consistent with the strategic logic of suicide terrorism. Because after all, it's not just, when we put down 150,000 combat forces in Iraq, it's not just Iraq that we have the possibility of transforming, it's the neighboring border countries to Iraq. And of course, as I'm sure many of you know, a number of those are on our hit list to go after next. And there's a large number of people in Washington that would like to go into Saudi Arabia and really get a hold of that government and fundamentally change it. Well, this has not been a happy talk. I wish I could come in and report that the war on terrorism is heading upward and northward and that we're about to really get a grip on this. The fact is, the war on terrorism is heading south. There are multiple reasons why it's heading south. But an important thing to see is that we have been waging the war on terrorism on a faulty premise. The premise that suicide terrorism is mainly a product of Islamic fundamentalism. If that premise were right, then it would actually make strategic sense to conquer Muslim countries, if we had to, in order to transform them, to wring the Islamic fundamentalism out of them. However, as I think you can see from the evidence, there is a strong cause for suicide terrorism, but it's mainly a response to the threat of foreign occupation. On 9/11, there were 12,000 American combat forces stationed on the Arabian Peninsula, 5,000 in Saudi Arabia, 7,000 in other countries. Today, over 150,000. And as that American combat presence has gone up, side by side, so has suicide terrorism, both from Al-Qaeda and from Iraq. Now, this does not mean, at least for me, that we should simply cut and run. We have important obligations in the region, chief among them being stability and access to oil. Nor do I think that we should simply stay and die, because the longer American and Western combat forces stay on the Arabian Peninsula, the greater the risk of the next 9/11, Bali bombings, London attacks, or worse. Instead, in the book, I argue for a different strategy, a new third approach. It's called offshore balancing, which in a nutshell is to rely on air power and naval forces offshore on the Arabian Peninsula to intervene in military crises if we need to, but not to station heavy combat power on the peninsula itself. And in fact, this strategy, offshore balancing, is very similar to the strategy the United States relied on successfully for decades in the 1970s and 80s. In the 70s and 80s, the United States successfully secured its interest in stability and oil in the region without stationing a single combat soldier there, even during the Iran-Iraq War, which was a major war. Instead, we relied on an alliance with Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and we can do that again. And even opponents of the war in Iraq should see that that's actually a good possibility that's come out of this. We stationed numerous aircraft carriers off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and air power is more powerful today than 30 years ago. And we maintained an infrastructure of bases on the peninsula without troops, but bases, so that we could rapidly deploy in a crisis if necessary. Well, that strategy of offshore balancing worked splendidly to reverse Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait in 1990. And offshore balancing is, again, our best strategy to secure our interests in the region, to reduce the number of suicide terrorists coming at us. And it's a strategy that we can maintain not just for a year or two and hold on by our fingernails the way we're doing now, but for decades, which is what we're going to need, because even the most optimistic assessments of energy independence see us depending on the region for oil for many decades to come. Now, specifically, over the next year, obviously you can see I'm not a big fan of the surge. I don't think the surge is a good idea. And nor, by the way, although I endorse, I think many of the goals of the Iraqi study group are right, nor do I think we can simply just cut and run in 4 or 6 months, because the truth of the matter is it does matter whether the level of violence stays where it is today or grows rather greatly. And I believe that what we should do is we should develop a real exit plan which focuses on the core way that the violence could spike from where it is today. Right now, throughout Iraq, there are about 100 people a day being killed. That number could go up greatly if heavy combat forces fall into the hands of the ethnic cleansers. Notice right now, that's not happening. The deaths that are happening by the ethnic cleansers, I'll call them, mainly the Shia ethnic cleansers, are happening with small arms and knives, to be direct, but they're not happening with heavy weapons. Well, we've given the Iraqi army about 200 tanks, APCs, and they have many hundreds of heavy machine guns. What we have to worry about is that those could fall into the hands of ethnic cleansers. And I'm sure many in the room will remember in Bosnia that when the Serbs used those heavy weapons against the Muslims, that's when things really got bad in April 1992, just on a dime. And I think we need to deal with that, and I think the way we should deal with it is just having a real policy of responding directly to the use of any heavy weapons in Iraq by anyone. I think that what we should do is we should have a policy that tries to keep a lid on the level of violence. I don't think it's actually reasonable to expect we're going to be able to bring it to zero. I think that's probably not realistic. But I do think we could have a policy that would help keep a lid on the violence, and I think then that would help us transition over 2 or 3 years to an offshore balancing strategy, which I think is our real long-term strategy for the future. Well, with that, let me just stop and take some questions, and thank you for listening to my talk.
Yeah, we can take some questions. She'll come around with the mic. Do we have another mic?
Hi. Asad Abu Khalil, California State University. I have one question about definitions, terrorism and stability.
Yep.
On terrorism, you seem to consider all acts of violence against military of democracies to be terrorism. If not, did you in any way politically or methodologically distinguish or catalog, tabulate the differences between how many were against military versus civilian targets. And on the subject of stability, which you talked about in the policy implication, you seem here to just be repeating the conventional talk of people in Washington, D.C. Stability for whom? And what if stability for, is it stability of the ability of the United States to project its troops and to extract the oil that doesn't belong to it? Or what if stability of the United States to achieve its objective is at the expense of the stability of people in their lives, as is the case in Iraq? Secondly, on the subject...
You've already got a lot of questions.
Yeah, please.
Why
Why don't we stick with that
last
question?
one.
Yeah.
Do you think the Department of Defense would come forward generously with funding if you were to catalog the death of Arabs and Muslims by U.S. bombs or Israeli bombs? Thanks.
Yep. First on the last, I do keep, my work on air power does do that, sir. The work on air power is basically to show that when you punish and kill civilians, the issue is not simply that it's immoral, it's ineffective. Most people that argue against using air power against civilians focus on the immorality of it, which for the Pentagon and for folks in Washington actually just gets dismissed because they say, you know, I'm sorry, we have to be immoral, but we need to do it for our interests. What my work on air power did and showed was that when you look at the effectiveness of bombing civilians, it makes matters far worse than it ever helps, just in terms of your interests. Just in terms of your interests. That has a different connection to the folks in Washington, and it's not that I think it's moral. It's that I think that the issue of effectiveness is terribly important. On the issue of how you count, whether you should count attacks against off-duty military, and I do count attacks against off-duty military as a suicide attack or as a terrorist attack, as well as against civilians. I do that because that's the way the literature started in the 1980s and continued into the 1990s. Suicide terrorism got its name in Lebanon. And you probably remember the most famous suicide terrorist attack for the Americans up until Iraq was the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in October 1983. That was called, by everybody, a suicide terrorist attack. So the fact is, first, it would seem odd to many people that you would have a definition which didn't include that attack since it was being... and secondly, it wouldn't really change the findings. You see, if you delete, what I'm saying is that 95% of suicide terrorist attacks fit this pattern. In order to really dilute it, you have to cut more than 50% of even 50% of the attacks, which it's not. But you have to delete from that list a lot of suicide terrorist attacks before you undermine that finding in a serious way. So the issue, sir, is that it wouldn't actually change the bottom line, which is what the main condition of the suicide terrorist attack is. And I think you had a third point, but I have to say I think I missed it.
Thank you, Bob. Let's go on to this side, and please be brief with the question. We have only about 5 minutes for questions. We can continue conversations later on. Yes.
Professor Pape, PR Atlas, Marion College, Indianapolis. I found your argument about strategic logic very compelling in the sense that there's a secular reason for why people are engaging in this. But I kept wondering how this relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yep. In the sense that the West Bank and Gaza have been occupied since '67, and for those who reject Israel completely, since Palestine's been occupied since 1948. But the first suicide bombings really begin around the beginning of the Oslo peace process.
Yep.
So how do you explain this particular change?
If you look at the data on the number of settlers in the West Bank since 1967, from 67 to 2000, you'll see the trajectory of suicide terrorism right in front of you. Because although it's true that Israel owned the West Bank in 67, the number of settlers actually settling on the West Bank is teeny tiny until the mid-1980s. That's when the real numbers begin to spike up, and that's about what precedes the first Intifada. And the argument that I lay out more in detail in the book is that suicide terrorism comes as a last resort. If it were about getting a quick trip to heaven, you wouldn't want it to be a last resort. You want it to do it as soon as possible. But the point is that what's happening in the Israeli case is that as the first Intifada heats up and does not stop the settlement, it just continues roaring on through the 90s. That's what's then encouraging the underpinning condition that's driving the suicide terrorism during that period. And when I published that first academic article in 2003, that was at the height of the Second Intifada, where there was virtually a suicide terrorist attack every week coming against Israel. I said at the end of that piece, Israel should do two things to end the suicide terrorism. Number one, they should unilaterally, no negotiated settlement, unilaterally withdraw from the territory in Gaza and the West Bank they wish to abandon. And number two, they should build a security fence on that line. Well, Israel, at the time, some of my friends said, don't say that, because Israel might do that, and then you could be proved wrong. Well, the fact is, Israel didn't do everything I suggested, and I would disagree with what they've done in the details, but they did about 70% of what that called for, and suicide terrorist attacks have been down over 90%. Well, if we could get a similar outcome here, I would think that was excellent. Again, I can't tell you that the policies here, the patterns, correspond to all suicide attacks, but if we could reduce it of some nature like that, I think we would be in better shape.
Excuse me. Yes, yes.
Charles Kogan, Kennedy School. This is a very impressive performance, and I don't want to contradict what you said, but I'm going to relate an event, which is a way of illustrating that in the Muslim world, religion and civil society are totally suffused. I just saw last week for the third time the Battle of Algiers, and this is very evident. Anyway, the event is this. A suicide bomber came into Jerusalem, and he blew himself up. However, only the detonator went off, and he fell unconscious. And when he woke up, he looked around him and asked, where are the virgins? And he kept repeating this question until they had to pull out their shin bet cards and show him that he was indeed back on earth.
I don't deny for a minute that religion plays a role. When we get to the individual logic of suicide terrorism, which I haven't had a chance to talk much about here, there are three individual micro-logics that matter. One is prestige, where individuals are doing it. If you see Paradise Now, this plays a big role there. Prestige is an important role. The second is revenge, also in Paradise Now. And the third, I would agree with you, Chuck, I would say religion plays a role. But what's important is that the commonality across those three is the additional factor of deep anger at the presence of foreign combat forces on territory that the terrorists prize. And absent that additional common factor, we hardly see those other three factors producing suicide terrorism independently. So I don't deny for a moment that there are mixtures of motives, and there's just more to be said there. The big point is, though, we don't see that absent this condition very often.
We're going to be able to take only two more questions, one on this side and one on that side.
Peter Moore, Tufts undergraduate. As a military and economic hegemon in this smaller world of instant communication, the United States is uniquely affected by media and popular sentiment. The current administration needs support to declare war on Iraq, and so tapped into the public fury at the events of September 11th and declared a war on terrorism and named an axis of evil. I think that terrorism is a response to it's a response, not a combatable evil in itself. Fighting a response only begets more of it. However, the immediate target of military action was Saddam Hussein, whose crime was a recognizable evil of genocide. After we got him, should we not have withdrawn? My real question is, has the U.S. entered into a war it cannot win by disingenuously obfuscating terrorism's role as a response? I think we're trying to fight a revolving door by pushing harder.
I'm not going to take any position on what caused us to get into the war here and why we got into it. We're going to be debating that for decades. My point is that unlike Vietnam, where we could just walk away, and we did from Vietnam, when we left in 75, we walked, did not look back for 20 more years. This is going to be different. The strategy I'm trying to suggest with offshore balancing is because this is not Vietnam. This is more difficult, more dangerous, more difficult than Vietnam. And it means it's harder to just simply say, yeah, let's just cut and run and walk.
Okay, the gentleman in the aisle. Oh, sorry. Okay, just yeah. I think he had his hand up. Then I'm sorry, we'll have to.
You talked about democracy. Democracy as being an important part.
What's your name, please? Yeah.
Oh, James Williamson. You talked about democracy as being an important part in your analysis, and I think there are. I would certainly question. I would start by saying I wonder how democratic Russia really is, but I think there are many of us who wonder how democratic the United States currently is. But whether you agree with that, the large increase in suicide attacks in Iraq arguably is not about a vulnerable democracy. So in what sense, what do you mean by democracies in your analysis? How central is that to your analysis? It seemed important as you laid it out. And secondly, you talk about the Arabian Peninsula, but in the communiques, as I understand them from Osama bin Laden, the focus is troops in the land of the two holy cities. There seems to be an emphasis and an inextricable link between the troops and the religiously based understanding of defiling of the land of the two holy cities. Something you can also see in Gadnin's discourse.
We need to.
So, if you could comment on that clarification.
We just have a 1 minute wrap up, but then yeah.
There's no doubt religion plays a role, but religion and nationalism often go together. Think how many purely secular American Jews we know who still think that Israel should have a homeland, even if they themselves are not observant, and even if they have no interest in themselves doing anything about that. That just goes to show that religion and nationalism often go hand in hand, and there's a lot more to say there, and I wish I could.
Please stay in your seats. The next session is going to start immediately without a break. Please give our speaker a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much.